So our third step for this week looks at the intersection between national security and constitutional history during the Wilson administration. And although Wilson was elected in 1912 with a focus primarily on domestic issues, he winds up having a very active and extremely controversial role in international affairs. In his defense, the U.S. is in part dragged into to World War One. Um, uh, the most famous of the episodes here is the sinking of the Lusitania, where by a German submarine off the coast of England. Um, Almost 1,300 are killed, including Americans. Wilson issues a protest note to the Germans telling them they must cease unrestricted submarine warfare, or else the United States will enter the war on the side of Britain and France, and Germany briefly postpones. Then they resume in 1916, and Wilson threatens again. But this question of what the president's appropriate role in sort of protecting or inserting the United States into European fighting is a tricky one. The irony here is that in 1916, in his re-election bid, Wilson, again, remember last time I was talking about in Stippets, Wilson is sort of pushing he needs to appeal to the left. Wilson is pushing the idea of himself as a peacemaker, someone who had kept the United States out of war, and it's this anti-militarist message that basically helps him win. The 1916 presidential election is an incredibly close race. Wilson is challenged by Charles Evans Hughes, a justice of the Supreme Court who had stepped down, former governor of New York. The Republican Party has reunified. Wilson carries the states that are in blue, Hughes the states that are in red. And there are three states that are particularly significant in 1916. Very, very close election in California. Wilson goes to bed thinking he has lost California. He wakes up seeing that he has won California. If Hughes had captured California, Hughes would have been elected with 267 electoral votes. Wilson would have gone down to 264. And California was a state with a very strong progressive approach. Wilson's anti-war message goes across very well. And the other two states that are worth noting are Nebraska and North Dakota. Both of these states go Democratic. This will be the last competitive election, presidential election, in which Nebraska and North Dakota go Democratic. These are not liberal states, and Wilson's victory here really is quite notable. He wins in part because he gets the endorsement of local Republican senators, left-wing Republicans. In North Dakota, this senator named Astley Grana. In Nebraska, George Norris, we saw him earlier with the idea of structural reform in Congress. And both of them are sort of excited by the idea that Wilson is someone who would keep the U.S. out of war. They see involvement in the war as basically something that will serve the interests of big business rather than the people as a whole. And it's anti-war Republicans that put Wilson over the top in North Dakota and Nebraska. And again, if Hughes had been able to carry these two states, reliably Republican states in most elections, Hughes would have defeated Wilson in 1916. In the event, Wilson, who campaigned on an anti-war platform, almost immediately goes back on his promises, in part because the Germans had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. And this is a drawing of him requesting from Congress authorization to declare war against Germany. This is in April of 1917. This is not World War II. It's not the war in Afghanistan after 9/11. There is significant opposition to a declaration of war in 1917. 6 senators vote against it. 50 members of the House vote against it. And those numbers almost certainly understated the degree of opposition, especially in the Midwest and the far West, where there was this pervasive sense that the U.S. was not entering the war for national security reasons, really. The argument was it was really entering the war to sort of save the bacon of business interests that had become reliant on an Allied victory in the war that was looking no sure, as if it was no sure thing in 1917. And remember last time with the nudes and the prudes and this idea of the progressives as thinking that it's appropriate to use governmental power to shape public opinion in the common good. We can laugh at the nudes and the prudes. Frankly, it's very laughable. Um, but these precedents create a far more dangerous set of laws. The Espionage Act of 1917, again, this concern that the public is not sufficiently supportive of the war, that this might undermine the war effort, and the result then is giving the federal government the power to crack down on dissent, making it unlawful for any person in time of war to publish any information that the president, in his judgment, declared to be of such character that it is or it might be useful to the enemy. That's an extremely broad definition. And then the next year, the Sedition Act of 1918, which makes the federal crime to willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military and naval forces of the United States. Again, this is criminalizing dissent, and there are some people who are charged and were convicted as a right during this. And two instances particularly stand out. The first is this guy, Charles Shank, who was a socialist, and as the position of the socialists in the 19 teens was that war existed to benefit the capitalist class. And so Shank in New York had passed out this pamphlet to men as they were waiting in line for selective service to be drafted, listing for them their rights, and telling that they should assert their rights, and that if they were conscientious objectors, they should say so. This is classic free speech. He was not attempting to disrupt the process in any way. He was simply providing this political pamphlet. But he's tried under the Espionage Act. He's convicted, and the case makes it to the Supreme Court in 1919, and the court through Justice Holmes upholds the Espionage Act, saying that there is no unlimited right to free speech. We all know in life, and for the analogy, Holmes points out that a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic would not be protected. And the standard that Holmes recommends that courts use to analyze this is that speech that creates a clear and present danger can be criminalized. Of course, this is what's a clear and present danger. And the idea that Shank, just by passing out a political pamphlet that reflects socialist thought on war, was engaging in a false shouting of fire in a theater designed to create a panic is of course is absurd. So it's analogizing, the opinion analogizes protected political speech to to speech designed to create a riot. It's a very, very troubling decision. And then maybe the highest profile prisoner of conscience during this period is a man named Eugene Debs, who was the socialist nominee for president in 1912, who chooses not to run in 1916, and his decision to choose not to run may very well have gotten Wilson the election, because Wilson gets a lot of that ex-socialist vote. Debs gives a speech critical of the war effort, reflecting socialist beliefs. In Cincinnati, he is tried under the Espionage Act. He is convicted, and he is sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Even in the Senate, there is an investigation that goes on for the entire duration of the war of Robert La Follette, who was the Wisconsin progressive, one of 6 members of the Senate to vote against the war. Shortly after that vote, La Follette travels to Minnesota, where he gives a speech, explaining why he voted against the war. It's a left-wing dissent. He says that the war was going to benefit big business and all of that. He is also misquoted in the initial story on his speech as suggesting that he would favor the Germans winning the war. And the result is cartoons like this. The Senate investigates him. It looks as if he may be expelled again for making a political speech about a public policy issue. What ultimately saves him is that after the 1918 elections, the margin is 49 Republicans and 47 Democrats, which means he basically controls the balance of power in the Senate. And after that point, both parties become much less interested in expelling La Follette. This era reaches its sort of farcical high point through the actions of this man, A. Mitchell Palmer, who was Wilson's last Attorney General, who organizes a series of raids after World War I on May Day. These are known as the Palmer raids. He claims to have evidence. Now it's not the pro-German sentiment; it's communist sentiment, and he claims to have evidence that communists are intent to overthrow the federal government on May Day. So the FBI raids all of, or the origins, the FBI, the Bureau of Investigation at that point, raids all of these alleged communist hotspots, and they find nothing, and Palmer is seen as ridiculous. But it's a reminder of the degree to which acceptance of suppressing speech, that is dissent, is framed as a national security issue during the Wilson years.